Bismillah, in this part we are going to now explore alternative assessment, namely developing assessment tasks and developing assessment rubrics. Now, alternative assessments refer to assessment other than the conventional pencil and paper standardized assessment method, which commonly employ the traditional MCQ, true-false, fill in the blanks item format. So here, alternative assessment is other than the traditional assessment. Examples of alternative assessment are case studies, portfolio, OSCE, okay, or objective structured clinical examination. Like for example, nurses would be assessed on how they treat the patients or how they follow up with the patients. For example, written report. Okay, quite typical, written report, verbal presentation, or project work or field work. These are examples of alternative assessment. Basically, they share one common same criteria or characteristic, which is it doesn't involve any pen and sit-in. Okay, pen and paper tests on focusing on answering question in an examination hall. Okay, so here, these are example of alternative assessment. Now, in designing alternative assessment, there are steps here outlined in the assessment handbook. Okay, first is to look into the purpose of the assessment. Okay, namely, you want to look as well into the outcome. Okay, what is the main purpose of having that assessment in order to shape the what kind of task that you want to give to the student. Then comes the task design. Okay, so in designing the task, you want to make sure that constructive alignment is adhered. Okay, so remember constructive alignment, meaning to say that the task will fulfill part of the learning outcome, okay, as well as consistent with the teaching instruction as well. Because, task design, the task is also a part of assessment. Okay, and then after the design is completed there, then the blueprint must be done. Okay, so in here previously we used the term TTS, yeah, that is actually outlined in the book there, but some other names is also being used as TOS. Okay, so table of specification test or blueprint, okay, TTS there, so you need to construct that. For assessment, alternative assessment, there's also the blueprint as well. Okay, there's also the blueprint as well, but usually it's combined together with the rubric as well. And then determine the essential qualities of the assessment, whether it's reliable or not. Do you have proper documentation so that multiple lecturers teaching the same course can reliably assess it using similar criteria? Okay, it is valid. Do you have proper documentation? Is the blueprint clear? Okay, and conform to the constructive alignment to make sure that the task given to the student is related to achieve the learning outcome or not, and is it fair or not. Okay, so is the documentation, is the instruction documented and communicated to the student in advance? Student have enough time to know how are they being assessed, to be prepared before the assessment, and etc. there. So those are the things that revolve around the fairness of the assessment management there. And lastly, the scoring. Okay, so there must be a rubric or a kind of grading guidance, okay, to help lecturers to grade, okay, the quality of students' assessment tasks. Now, these are the few considerations that you want to take into when designing the assessment task. Now, remember, assessment task here refers to the task that you are giving to students to do as part of their assessment, as part of their grade to fulfill a certain course, right? Like for example, they need to make a portfolio, and that will be an example of an assessment task there. So you want to consider the practicality of the assessment task. It should be a task whereby it can be done within a certain amount of time. You don't want to give a task that requires student to, the course is only for 1 week, but the task takes about 3 months to complete. That's not practical. Okay, so or even the course is 14 weeks, right, for Gombak and 12 weeks for CFS, for example. The course is, let's say, 14 weeks. The task, okay, requires student to do it in 14 weeks as well, but that one is also not practical. Because why? Just imagine immediately at the first class they need to do it, start. Okay, and then it's very much stressful there. So there's no gap, there's no buffer in between. Okay, or outer layer of the assessment. So it should be practical. So you can assess the practicality in terms of the time. Okay, required for it to be completed. It is practical in the sense that it is not beyond students' ability. Like for example, even though it can be done within 1 month, okay, but it requires student to have a lot of money to buy a certain software, for example, okay, to complete the task there, and they don't have that kind of software being made available to them. So that's not practical. Okay, so that's not practical there. So practicality can be in terms of time, in terms of the kind of tasks, okay, within the ability of the student, okay, and it has to be practical as well for the lecturers to assess as well. So if the task is done, okay, overseas, and you are here teaching at Gombak, right? So it's not and you must observe them doing it face to face, right? And then suddenly, one student do it in London, and then the requirement is that you have to observe face to face there. That's not practical for even lecturers to go to London and just for the sake of assessing that. So practicality can be in different forms there. So the key word there is that it has to be feasible, okay, to be done. Authenticity means to say that the how much the gap between the assessment task and what is happening in the real world. Okay, for example, in a science course, okay, the real world scientists use microscope. Okay, they use microscope in order to observe, slides or what there, so assessment task, okay, is deemed as authentic, okay, if it is very close to what is happening in the real world. So the assessment task is that you test students on how they use microscope, right? So there's an example there. So if let's say the course, that one is for science, right? Let's say for arts, for example, the course is teacher, okay, teacher training, right? So the real world is that teacher will face students, okay, and teach, content, for example, and the assessment task would be to teach, okay, stimulated, a simulation of teaching stimulation, for example. That would be considered as a assessment task that is authentic. Okay, so remember, authentic is how close it is to what is happening in the real life setting. Reliability, we'll talk about this before already, is about consistency, okay, of the task assessment. Having rubrics, having a clear written guideline on how to do it will increase reliability and consistency between students, okay, and lecturers grading it. Validity, you must have the alignment happening there. So you have to know the task is supposed to aim to measure the CLO1, for example, there. So do you have a documentation guiding you, okay, on to make sure that the task must be measuring the intended CLOs, and that one influences validity. And the washback or backwash effect, okay, refers to the effect of the assessment towards their teaching and learning practices. Okay, so the effect of the assessment practices in influencing the teaching and learning experience. For example, if the assessment is exam oriented, then it will influence the student to only do, drill practice set of answering question only, and that affects authenticity. You have a public speaking course, okay, but if the assessment is, final exam 40% MCQ question, okay, so that is less authentic. And then in terms of the washback or backwash effect there, during the classes, students and lecturers might be focusing on drilling with answering question about public speaking, which is quite weird, okay, whereby if the assessment is much more authentic, okay, and the assessment is about, you have 40%, each 10% they need to deliver a speech, for example, there. So if they know that the assessment is to deliver a speech, then it will influence their teaching and learning or their class time in practicing more of delivering speech. Okay, so it influences. So the key point here for washback or backwash effect here is that assessment practices influence the teaching and learning approach. Okay, inshallah we are going to move on to the next part of this alternative assessment.